Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of January 7th, 2024, our first salon of the new year. And as I have remarked to our panel before the start, it is indeed quite astonishing that we have been holding these salons now since May of 2020. We have had our partnership with our friends at KGRA Radio since November of 2021, so for over 2 years now. And we continue to bring you thoughtful, multifaceted, intellectual conversations that hopefully provide you with some innovative ideas about how the future of humanity can be improved. And today will be just such a salon. Joining us is our distinguished panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg, our 2024 U.S. Vice Presidential Candidate, Director of Community and Citizen Science, Daniel Tweed, and our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer. Welcome to all of our officers. And our guest today is David Patterson, whom many of you know as a recurring guest on our virtual Enlightenment salons. He first attended in September to speak about his concept of active communities, and then we had a debate in November between David Patterson and David Wood on the future of technological progress. And now David Patterson returns to discuss the idea of social learning groups and how people all over the world can harness this concept and better themselves in an age of increasingly abundant resources and opportunities, but perhaps one where people need more structure in order to take advantage of those opportunities. So David, welcome once again, and please tell us about social learning groups.
Thank you, Gennady. I also want to thank the panelists and viewers who are with us. I look forward to your questions and to an interesting discussion about social learning groups. Social learning groups are groups where people meet to learn or engage in personal development. It's a coincidence that we're talking about this at the start of the year, but it's appropriate since participating in social learning groups can be a great way to help people achieve their New Year's resolutions. Most New Year's resolutions involve some sort of self-improvement, learning, or personal development goal. Social learning groups can help with all of those. I want to talk about the benefits of these groups and how they're relevant to transhumanists and the United States Transhumanist Party. And that's, at the same time, I'll talk about the 3 different types of social learning group. One type of group is called a personal development group. It can be based on any self-improvement book, such as a book about improving health and longevity. Health and longevity are topics of interest to transhumanists, while at the same time having a wide appeal that can make starting a group more practical and sustainable. 2 other types of social learning group are online learning groups and self-study groups. These can be focused on any topic covered by any online course or book. Books can include books about transhumanism as well as any political subject. Unlike active community groups, which I spoke about in a previous virtual Enlightenment Salon and which are designed to appeal to as wide an audience as possible, social learning groups are independent groups and can focus on specific needs and interests. Active community groups support the development of social learning groups and encourage people to participate in these groups, But social learning groups can be started anywhere, even where there's no active community group, and they are faster and easier to start. Just as a reminder, in my previous, one of my previous appearances on the Virtual Enlightenment Salon, I talked about active community groups. What they are is they are community groups which promote improvements in health, prosperity, and education for individuals and communities, and they use social engagement, motivation, and morality to facilitate those improvements. Active community groups meet every 2 weeks. Members are also encouraged to participate in action groups to focus on specific things to improve their lives. The personal development group is an example of an action group. The other two types of social learning group can help active community members reach their educational goals. But once again, I want to emphasize that social learning groups can be started by anyone at any time, anywhere. They are not directly tied to having an active community group. Now I'll talk about the benefits of social learning groups. The idea of social learning groups is to add a social component to learning and personal development that you would otherwise not get on your own by reading a book or following an online course. The benefits of learning as a group including learning better, staying motivated, and improving your health. Improvement in mental and physical health happens independent of the subject matter of the group. That's because social engagement on its own has been proven to improve mental and physical health. In studies of drugs for mental health, for example, the placebo effect often works as well or better than the drugs being tested. Data about placebo benefits tends to be discarded and ignored since drug companies can't charge anything for the placebo effect. Being cared for, taking action to care for yourself, being listened to, along with social engagement, all contribute to this health improvement. Studies of social engagement have shown improvements to longevity, mood, immunity, and cognition. The name social learning group comes from the concept of social learning. We learn better when we discuss our learning with others and when we teach or share what we learn with others. Learning or working on self-improvement with others can be a source of inspiration, encouragement, and accountability. Group engagement has been shown to improve adherence and performance in exercise and diet programs, for example. Now I'll go into a bit more detail about each of the types of social learning groups, starting with personal development groups. For a personal development group, you can use any type of self-improvement book, any self-improvement book. Sections of the book can be read silently during the meeting. Some people have already read the book or will be at a different part in the book in their personal reading, so a review is always beneficial. That reading alternates with discussion on plans to apply the concepts and a discussion of what has worked for group members in the past. When you share your past successes, you're recalling self-efficacy, which is a technique that involves remembering specific instances when you have successfully demonstrated your competence and overcome a challenge in the past. This has been shown to improve motivation, confidence, and resilience. When you talk about what you plan to do in the future, you are engaging in episodic future thinking. Episodic future thinking is the ability to imagine or simulate possible events that might happen in your personal future. Episodic future thinking creates motivation that is more sustained and long-term than dopamine-based motivation. People are more able to endure hardships and difficulties to reach benefits that they have envisioned for their future. Episodic future thinking can facilitate planning and selecting among options and has been shown to improve emotional regulation, motivation, and commitment. Self-efficacy and episodic future thinking, along with the benefits of social engagement, make personal development group meetings beneficial in themselves, regardless of the subject matter, regardless of which self-improvement book you choose. In addition, you will get enhanced benefits in being able to learn and apply what you learn from the book better than if you're reading and studying alone. The next type of group is the online learning group. I worked on a social project for several years in Haiti. The project was called a Social Learning Center. It was like an internet cafe, but it was run by local volunteers and focused on learning computer skills and online learning. I wanted to adapt that project to add social support for people studying online courses in developed countries. Most people in developed countries have access to a laptop, so online learning groups are more simple and lower cost than the Social Learning Center was. People can just bring their laptops and meet in any room with a Wi-Fi connection. I created an online learning group to help people learn the French language. They learned primarily with Duolingo. I stayed in contact with a couple of the participants for several years after the last time I spoke with, and the last time I spoke with them, they were both on a greater than 1,000 day learning streak on Duolingo. Prior to participating in the group, they had never used Duolingo or any online learning. The social elements that we added to the meetings were a 10 to 15-minute presentation by one of the participants at the beginning on a topic related to the French language, which would be educational and inspirational. That was followed by an online study session during which participants could help each other, followed by a 15 to 20-minute social break. The social break is one of the most important parts of these meetings since it bonds the group together. This would be followed by more online study. Then we would close by having each person share one or two things that they learned during the meeting. We did this once per week, the idea being to keep people motivated and to make sure that they did at least the minimum study in these 2 to 3 hour meetings each week. In addition to the learning benefits of such a group, they would also have the social benefits and mental and physical health benefits that I mentioned previously. The third type of group is a self-study group. Self-study groups are like online learning groups, except they're based on a book or textbook. Unlike personal development groups, they can be used to learn anything, not just self-improvement. More practical activities such as practice work and peer review of exercises and essays can be added to turn the book or textbook into the equivalent of an in-person course. Online learning groups and self-study groups can also be grouped together. There are existing online learning programs and qualifications which can be enhanced by creating online learning groups to support learners. New programs can be created by grouping online learning groups and self-study groups together into programs. To ensure continuity and coordination, it is a good idea to have a board of directors for any series of online courses for which you want to create online learning or self-study groups. It's also possible to group together related personal development groups to create a more comprehensive program of self-improvement. These can be an alternative to university and college programs with the benefit of adding back much of the social benefit that is lost when switching from in-person to online and self-study. In conclusion, social learning groups are easy to start. They have amazing social and health benefits, and it's easy to start one yourself. For more information, you can go to the website sociallearning.group. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, David, for that overview of social learning groups. And we have some questions from our audience already. The first questions come from our member, Alan Crowley. He wonders, how are social learning groups different from, for instance, the Enlightenment Salons or the Great Books program or local writing workshops? And then he also gives the example of organizations such as Lions Club or Toastmasters. So to the extent that you can speak to similarities and differences between social learning groups and these other available formats or organizations, what are some of the distinguishing features there?
Thank you, Janetti. The difference, that was quite a lot of things, so I'll try and go through as many as I can. The difference between that and any sort of online interaction, such as virtual enlightenment salons, is that you're really trying to bond together a group in person that can end up being friends and end up having all the social benefits of having more close and personal friendships. That's been shown to have health benefits, both physical and mental health benefits. it's also a way of engaging people so that they're more committed in a way that you might not get otherwise. There is a similarity between groups like Toastmasters, except that Toastmasters is a very specific type of group, and it's based on content that you use a book or one of the available books, or now they have online learning, but it does not it does not allow you to do any book or online learning program of your choice. So it's a question of flexibility. There are a lot of groups that do personal development. So they don't go by the name personal development groups, but there are 12-step programs, for example, recovery groups. These programs, they're 12-step programs, for example, to help you get out of debt, help you earn more income, all sorts of things. The idea behind social learning groups is it takes advantage of the exact same principles that they're taking advantage of, which is to engage people and have them support each other. It just gives you more options for what you want to do with that group. It's very easy to start a social learning group. It doesn't really cost much, or sometimes not anything, depending on the cost of renting a room to meet. So it's really just a matter of promoting that concept and generalizing it.
All right, thank you for that response, David. And Alan has replied. He says, check, I like the distinction of the social learning groups being in person. And he does have a follow-up question. He states, this seems to be developing a classification for what some people already do and a few new formats for that class of group. Is that an accurate assessment, or is there a distinction? If so, what would be that distinction? I think he's referring to the fact that there are people who meet in ways that would indeed contain many of the elements of a social learning group and have many of the same purposes already.
Thank you for that question. There are existing groups that do this, but as I said, the concept of social learning groups is to promote that more generally, and to provide support for people who want to do that. I'm sorry, Janetti, was there something more specific in that question?
Yes, so essentially he was wondering, is there some like completely new element that you're introducing with the concept of the social learning groups, or are you trying to generalize a practice that already exists but maybe might not have been identified by that particular name or as systematically as you have done?
Right. So there are people who have gathered together to support each other using a self-help book as a basis. That tends to be a fairly random process, though. What I would like to do is get people support in doing that kind of thing and encourage them to do it. So through my other project, Active Community, that's something we're going to do, is encourage people to start these social learning groups, particularly the ones that are personal development groups. There are personal development groups, as I said, like the 12-step programs that are not based on a book. They do have a book as well, but the book is secondary to the actual meetings, and it was based on the meetings. But probably the most unique aspect of this is the online learning group. I know of personal development groups that have formed around books or around groups, but there's a lot of online learning that's become available over the past decade, and people tend to just study online, and the opportunity to add back social engagement to that is something that I haven't seen. So the online learning group is the most original component, and that's the one that I've actually implemented. The others I am basing on what others have done.
So the online learning group is innovative in the sense that it is focused on online study, but there is this in-person component of social interaction that reinforces what people are learning. And instead of people just learning purely on their own, they're essentially creating a small community around that learning endeavor that persists into the future and helps people with achieving their goals.
Yeah, people who study online learning tend to easily disengage from it, or it can be because they don't understand how the online learning interface works. And so being in a room with people at least once a week where you can turn to the person next to you and ask them how it works, or ask them a question about the content, that's very valuable to facilitate your use of those online learning systems. It's also, you also get social interaction that you don't get with online learning. There's a lot of advantages to being on campus at a university studying. There's the fraternities, there's social engagement with social organizations. So it's a way of bringing some of that back so that online learning can become more like in-person learning, and you get some of those social advantages. You're able to establish friendships, you're able to continue, you're able to be more motivated. There's also the aspect of structure, just having that at least once a week meeting. You can study more on your own, but at least you get together once a week and it keeps you going, and then you get motivated.
Yes, thank you for that explanation. And Alan Crowley also says, thank you for clarifying that so well. I love this idea and see it as a strong way forward as we prepare for myriad ways our society will shift due to realignment with new technology. And also, Jason Geringer shared in our YouTube chat that he has what he considers to be a social learning group on Facebook called The Wisdom of the Crowd. And here's the link to anybody who is interested in seeing what Jason has posted there. But so far, it has been solely a Facebook group. Jason says group engagement was always his biggest problem, and that group has not done as well as he had hoped. He started it with opinion polls. He has lessons on the Facebook group, and with the opinion polls, the group can help to control what is in the educational curriculum. But he can see, based on your description of social learning groups, that this is different. I think the main difference is that the social learning group type that you outlined, David, has the in-person component. Now, Jason, would you like to elaborate more about the wisdom of the crowd? Anything else that you want to say about that, and how that compares with David's concept?
Yeah, when I first started it, I was really concerned with disinformation, and it was back during the time when part of the reason how I got political in the first place, I started by creating a social learning group, and I figured if could get a group that can pool their knowledge on what is true and not true, and so part of the plan was to have the group discriminate the information, and plus give their opinion on which is the best lesson, and over time the better lessons would be there, and that was the idea anyway. So that's about it.
Yes, thank you for that explanation. So Jason, do you think if there were an in-person component to the wisdom of the crowd group, that you would get more participation, that you would get more people contributing content and perhaps opining on which content is reliable?
Well, sure, probably. I have no idea how I'd do that, though. I'm a hermit, you know. So, of course, there's all kinds of stuff that we could probably do that I just kind of don't get around to doing. I need one of those, what do you call them? Around to it. I need to get around to it. It's a little joke.
Well, don't we all? This also seems to be an aspect of our internet age where there is such an abundance of information and a greater degree of, let's say, projects, commitments that one could undertake as compared to the time available. So something will fall by the wayside unless it is made a priority. But I do see the benefits of this kind of in-person interaction. One of the issues is our transhumanist community is so geographically dispersed that it is a challenge to even find several people in a particular geographical area to meet on a regular basis. The virtual formats have been wonderful in that we have been able to bring people from all over the world to meet regularly and exchange ideas. And I understand some of the limitations of even the online video formats, but they have improved tremendously during the past decade. They're higher bandwidth now. We can do longer streams. We can do more in-depth streams. And that is something. That is a method of interaction that wouldn't have been available to us even a decade ago. YouTube started out with a feature called Hangouts on Air, which was actually quite nice. And I did some live streams using the Hangouts on Air, but they were discontinued in 2019. And then special means had to be employed to resume live streams. Our first virtual Enlightenment salons were done via Zoom. And one of our officers would have OBS software to essentially stream this to YouTube. Then, fortunately, we were able to launch our partnership with KGRA, and we use StreamYard through KGRA to be able to broadcast our salons not just to YouTube, but to Facebook, to X, formerly Twitter, and we have it also saved on multiple other podcast venues. So that is a great improvement. But I wonder, David, what advice, if any, would you have for people within the transhumanist community in regard to launching social learning groups and having more of an in-person interactive component, given the geographically dispersed nature of our community thus far?
Thank you, Janetti. I'll just first make one comment on Facebook social learning groups. I think I'm not on Facebook, but I think they have an actual feature called social learning groups, but it's an online group. It's a discussion group, basically an online discussion group. So it's the same name, but it's a different concept, just to clarify that. You mentioned that transhumanists are dispersed, and it makes it difficult to get people together in a group except at a national level and a virtual meeting. There's two things that can be done. One is that you can broaden the subject matter so that it includes life extension and it includes health in general, because a lot of the life extension things that you can do today are just general health things that reduce your chance of type 2 diabetes, reduce your chance of cancer, reduce your chance of heart disease, reduce your chance of dementia. In fact, one of the things that can reduce your chance of dementia is social engagement. So those are all very important things. So that's one opportunity, is to create groups that have a broader appeal. And you'll find people in most medium to large size communities, even smaller communities, who are interested in improving their health and longevity in that way. And then if one or two transhumanists are also at those meetings, then they can meet in person, and that's very empowering, and they may even be able to discuss their ideas with other people at the group. The other opportunity is to have online meetings. Ideally, you would want in-person meetings, but you can do this through online meetings. I think Zoom has a feature where you could break out into smaller discussion groups. So if you have a large group, you can break it down into smaller groups. But as far as having a group that is broad-based, that's a good idea. That's something where you could actually expand your base.
Yes, and it does seem to me that there are subjects, as you point out, where transhumanists could find alignment with other individuals, people who are maybe transhumanist adjacent but have certain similar interests. And if the subject of that social learning group is one that unites these individuals, at least in terms of certain shared goals, then there could be a broader base there in a particular geographical area, some cross-pollination of knowledge and ideas and projects. Also, the idea that there could be some online meeting component to this as well. So there are some advantages to in-person meetings, but perhaps a lot of the meetings could be online, and there could be occasional in-person meetings, maybe even involving, say, food to motivate people to get together. Actually, the original Enlightenment salons for the Transhumanist Party that were hosted in my house involved a component of food. We would actually order pizza, we would have tea and desserts as well. And of course, it was a smaller venue, so we had generally 4 to 6 people at one of those Enlightenment salons, and you can still see video recordings of them. I will share them in the YouTube chat. But there was this kind of appreciation of the in-person format as well. So we have some additional questions. Mike Lazine wonders, would college or trade school classes be considered social learning groups? And Alan Crowley also writes in this regard that his local county college has a program for people over the age of 50 where anyone in that group can teach a class or attend a class. And to him, that seems very much like a social learning group. What is your reaction to those observations, David?
Thank you for that. Those questions. Colleges or trade schools and programs where people could come in and teach or learn. I don't know what the social components would be to that, but I do know that a lot of universities have added a social component to their learning. For example, one example was in the 1970s, they noticed that Blacks and Hispanics who went to, I think it was Berkeley in California, they were failing out of first-year calculus at an alarming rate compared to whites and Asian students. The interesting thing is this was before a lot of affirmative action started to be brought in. So these students who were failing out, they qualified to get in. They met the standards. They were successful at high school. They had the marks to get into the university. So there was a study done to find out what was going on. And what they found was that particularly the Asian students would get together in groups. They would study together, and they would not only learn the content together, they would learn how the system works, how to go to the meetings with the professor to get more help. And they would also get the feeling that when they came across a question where they didn't know the answer, they would know that it was because the question was difficult. It was not because they were stupid. So people individually, they feared that maybe it was just a stupid question, so they're scared to ask. So what they did is they brought in a program. I've forgotten the name of the program, but it's now widely used in universities. And it essentially puts people together into groups with a teaching assistant. And there's very little or no instruction in those groups. They actually give them problems more difficult than they will get on their homework. And whether or not they solve these problems isn't the point. The point is that they will learn how to do these difficult things, and that will make their homework problems even easier. And so that's a way in which a college or a tech trade school or anything can add a social component that will make the learning better. And the results were quite dramatic. It significantly improved the results of the Black and Hispanic students.
Yes, thank you for those responses, David. And I also wanted to share the links to the first 3 Transhumanist Party Enlightenment Salons, which you can watch in a combined stream, as well as the 4th and 5th Enlightenment Salons. These are the components that we recorded, but there were also informal components, like when we were eating meals, where we had the opportunity essentially to socialize, provide updates on our respective endeavors. And the original Enlightenment Salons also, of course, were held in person in the 18th and early 19th centuries, because they didn't have virtual sessions or the ability to host those, but they were essentially the highlights of the social life of certain segments of the aristocracy and the upper middle classes, the rising industrial class as well. And people were able to discuss philosophy, history, math, science, contemporary events. So I think it would be quite beneficial to bring back those kinds of formats in some way, shape, or form. Now, it's also interesting that you mentioned how students of Asian origin have often gotten together to study various subjects on their own. And I was friends with a lot of Asian students when I was in high school. I was on the math team. And on the math team, generally speaking, the majority of the students were either Asian or Russian. And we had maybe a couple of native-born American students. This was in suburban Chicago. I still have medals and ribbons from the North Suburban Mathematics League in the display behind me. And I remember, because the problems within the math competitions were much more difficult than the material we were taught in class, we would meet sometimes spontaneously after school to prepare for the math tournaments and make sure that we studied more advanced subject material. We had relay teams as well. I was captain of the freshman sophomore relay team that ended up winning the Illinois State tournament. This was back in 2003. So I can testify to the benefit of that approach, having been involved in it myself. Now, I want to also pose a question from Daniel Tweed. He points out that perhaps book discussion clubs have some social learning group aspects to them. Would you agree with that, David?
Yes, I would agree with that. The personal development group is intended to be based on a book, and it is a book discussion group. But the important thing is to make it not just broad discussion, but to focus on the specific things that will be beneficial. So you really want to assist people to apply the concepts they're learning in the case of a personal development group, because often you can read a self-help book, self-improvement book, and you can think, these are great ideas, I really want to do these. But as soon as you move on to the next chapter, you've almost forgotten. And then once you put down the book, you've completely forgotten most of the things. You might pick up a thing or two that you'll carry forward. But if you really want to work on implementing those things, then being together with a group and discussing how you're going to implement those things is really beneficial. And once you've done something to implement them, or you have an example of where you've done something similar in the past, you do get this benefit of self-efficacy, where you talk about your accomplishments from the past, things where you were competent and achieved something. That has a very positive mental and physical health benefit, because there have been studies done on this self-efficacy, and it's a way of reducing depression, increasing motivation, a lot of benefits. So the other thing you really want to focus on is the episodic future thinking, where there's a lot of motivational speakers who tell you need to take action right away to do whatever you want and go, go, go. Well, in reality, you need motivation, but you also need ability, and you have to develop that ability over time. So doing something like going to school or trying to learn through a business in a way that will allow you to learn something before you start more challenging projects, you need to be able to sustain the motivation to make those sacrifices and to do those studies and to gain the experience. And so episodic future thinking is a way that allows you to develop that sustained motivation that allows you to work towards things in the future, even when it requires sacrifice and suffering now. Whereas a lot of the go out and do it right now kind of motivation, it pumps you up on adrenaline and dopamine and gives you stories about success and makes it sound like all you have to do is go out and do it. But really, what most people need, and this is probably all of our experience, is education and experience. We've all gone to school. Some of us have been to higher education, a lot of work experience. I've been to Haiti and put in some tough time there working on a project. So you need a future goal that is motivating for you to be able to do that. And so these are the types of things that you want to focus on in a social learning group, particularly a personal development group. You can also turn any book or online course into a social learning group. So you could take a textbook, and let's say you're somewhere, maybe it's in a different country where you can't go to Harvard or wherever, and maybe you don't have access to the online course. You can get that textbook by a Harvard professor, and you can, if you can get together with enough people who are interested in studying that, if you're in a big city probably, then you can turn that into a course. You can add content to your course, like you can do the practice problems and have your peers check the problems, and you can work together on them as a team. So it's in the way the book is turned into something more that distinguishes a book discussion group from a social learning group or a personal development group.
Yes, thank you for that response, David. And Mike Lazine followed up stating, David is making great points with books. Even if you underline things and dog-ear them, you will have an issue finding the points you are looking for, but perhaps with the social component that could reinforce one's learning. Daniel also pointed out that Benjamin Franklin's junto in Philadelphia could be an example of an early social learning group. And indeed, Wikipedia states that the Junto, also known as the Leather Apron Club, was a club for mutual improvement established in 1727 by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia. The Leather Apron Club's purpose was to debate questions of morals, politics, and natural philosophy, and to exchange knowledge of business affairs. Franklin organized a group of friends to provide a structured form of mutual improvement. This group, initially composed of 12 members, called itself the Junto, from the Spanish word junta, or assembly. And keep in mind, this was 1727. Franklin was born in 1706, so he was 21 years old when he organized the Junto, and it was a group of young men, up and coming young men at the time, who essentially banded together to discuss intellectual subjects, but also their practical application, because they were seeking to make their way up in the world. So, David, do you think this was an early example of a social learning group, contemporaneous with the Enlightenment Salons, by the way?
Yeah, it was probably among the first. And Benjamin Franklin's autobiography is among the first self-improvement books. He talks about how he made deliberate efforts to improve himself. He had a checklist of things that he wanted to improve about himself. He would focus on one each week or month. I forget which it was, and then he would evaluate himself each day on how well he was improving on that particular aspect, and then he would move on to another aspect of himself that he wanted to improve. And he wrote this book with these ideas. So that was, for anyone who reads that book, it's a self-improvement book. It shows how Benjamin Franklin became the man that he was. He could have just drifted. When he arrived in Philadelphia, he arrived with, I think, 2 loaves of bread and $1 in his pocket, and he gave one of the loaves of bread away. So he didn't have much, but he had his ideas about self-improvement. Now, the Junto group is definitely, he had the same concept. It was, he needed to be together with others who shared his values, his value for education, his ideas. And again, that is something that you're missing if you just read a book or if you just do online education. Getting together with a group is very motivating, and the social benefits can be very great. It's hard to itemize all the different social benefits, but it's empowering. He was able to make political connections through Junto, and that helped him get business for his printing company. It helped him become successful in politics. It helped him become ambassador to France. So it's not, social connections are much more than just for learning the content of a book. The social connections can be quite powerful. We've talked about the health benefits. So yeah, Benjamin Franklin, he was first in quite a lot of things. He was a scientist as well as a diplomat and politician. And he wrote one of the first self-help books, and
Yes,
formed one of the first self-help organizations or social learning groups, essentially.
Absolutely. And Mike Lazine writes, Benjamin Franklin was a genius, so I'm not surprised about his accomplishments. And the autobiography that Benjamin Franklin wrote is available for free from Project Gutenberg. So if you haven't read it yet, please go and read it. I remember reading it when I was 20 years old, so close to the age when Benjamin Franklin founded the Junto. And I found it both quite inspiring and quite useful in terms of the structures and the approaches that Benjamin Franklin pursued toward self-improvement. So definitely a great parallel there to what you're trying to achieve with social learning groups, David. Now, Daniel Tweed wonders if there might be a concern, perhaps, with some of the out there conspiracy theories like QAnon and flat eartherism, and could there be people who get together in a social learning group format to discuss those subjects and maybe reinforce some delusions or misinformation or conspiracies that have no relation to reality? And if so, how can that be counteracted? Is there something about social learning groups that might actually prevent that or lead to a greater likelihood of the truth coming out instead of these theories based on misinformation?
It's a good question. Thank you, Daniel. The what I discussed in one of my previous appearances on Virtual Enlightenment Salon was active community, and that's more of a group where it's open to everyone, and you want to be apolitical as much as possible in order to get as many people to participate from a community. The advantages of that kind of group are that it actually works against political polarization and conspiracy theories, because you're talking to a broad group of people who are probably not going to agree with your ideas, especially if they're wrong. There are some conspiracy theories that are true. So, it all comes out as part of open debate. We work through these issues and people can learn more and make better decisions. What's a real problem is that online it's been very easy to organize ourselves into echo chambers on social media. In fact, the social media algorithms actually automatically organize us into echo chambers because they feed us posts that reflect our views and that we're likely to interact with in a positive way, which people will if it confirms their biases. So anything that will get people out into the real world where they're with other people and discussing issues will be beneficial, even though, unlike active communities, social learning groups can focus on very specific topics, and it could very well end up being a conspiracy topic. I should point out that social learning groups will not be directly associated with active communities, so anyone can start one on any topic. So the topics are not going to be approved in any way prior, and I think that's a good thing. That's free speech and free association, and hopefully, just by getting out into a group with broader beliefs, at least in some sense, will help people to think through what they're thinking about, and at least it would reduce radicalization. I hope there are people who, when they're isolated, come up with some very extreme ideas, and we saw that with QAnon. There were some physical attacks. We've seen that with other things. So just getting out with a group of people, even if it's a group of people that is focusing on your particular interest, they're going to help you to avoid those more extreme ideas, because they'll just tell you that's a bad idea. Don't attack people. If you're a QAnon supporter, fine, but most people who are QAnon supporters are not going to support violent action or anything like that. So even those smaller groups that are more focused on a particular issue, I think there will be a moderating effect for extremism, and you do get the benefit of the social contact, which is just gonna, some people get overstressed, they get depressed, they get totally hyper-focused on an issue, and it just, the social benefit will help to calm that down.
Yes, thank you, David, and I definitely hope that that would be the case. Daniel also clarified that he should have used a term like disinformation echo chamber, which would be more precise than conspiracy theory. But I think we all know what Daniel meant with expressing his concern. Now, it's interesting, too, on the subject of Benjamin Franklin. We've had a lot more feedback as well from our friend Matt Richards, who writes that he was a great character far and away before his time. He envisioned a world where technology will change humans one day. And Mike Lazine actually wondered whether Benjamin Franklin could be considered a transhumanist. He is definitely a proto-transhumanist. He would have been a transhumanist if he had been alive today. But if you consider these words from Benjamin Franklin, the rapid progress true science now makes occasions my regretting sometimes that I was born so soon. It is impossible to imagine the heights to which the power of man may be carried over matter in 1,000 years. We may perhaps learn to deprive large masses of their gravity and give them absolute levity for the sake of easy transport. Agriculture may diminish its labor and double its produce. All disease may by sure means be prevented or cured, not excepting even that of old age, and our lives lengthened at pleasure even beyond the antediluvian standard. And this
I didn't know he said that.
Oh, absolutely. This was written in the 1780s, and he essentially forecast these changes over the next millennium. Now, everything that he wrote about for now, except for the cure to old age, has actually come to pass. So, for instance, easily transporting large masses. Well, we can do that now. Or doubling agricultural produce. We have more than doubled it. Yes, we have more than doubled it in the course of the green agricultural revolution. So this one prediction, this one hope of Benjamin Franklin's is one that has yet to come to pass, but he would have definitely appreciated a cure for old age. So most definitely a proto-transhumanist and one of us, not just in terms of that, but in terms of the Enlightenment philosophy that motivated him, the spirit of self-improvement, what he did with the junto. All of those are strong parallels. So now Mike Lazine also points out that artist communities might also qualify in this regard as social learning groups when artists talk to each other about one another's works and the background surrounding them. And Art Ramon writes that art functions are his second in-person meetings. So, David, what do you think about that? Can artistic communities also be social learning groups?
I think there are definitely social groups, and they can have some of the same benefits as a junto type group. It all depends on how much focus they put on whether the goal of the group is learning or is it something else, or is it social. The Bloomsbury Group is a well-known organization of British writers and intellectuals from, I believe, the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they were able to act as a social learning group, at least from the point of view of inspiring each other and helping each other with resources. You know, one would have a publisher, they could learn about how to get their work published, and with their contacts in the literary field, including journalists, they could get reviews of their books done. So it was similar to junto a bit in the way that Benjamin Franklin was able to advance his career by using his political career and his printing operation by using the contacts that he had. So, I mean, what I'm proposing with social learning groups is something much more simple, which anyone can benefit from. particularly the health benefits, but you can focus a group on prosperity or any sort of self-improvement thing, any learning that you want to do. If there's learning that is important to you, but there's no program or course on it, you can just find a book on that topic and make that the basis of your group.
Yes, indeed. And I will also share the Wikipedia entry for the Bloomsbury group. This one met in the early 20th century. So Wikipedia states that the Bloomsbury group, or Bloomsbury set, was a group of associated English writers, intellectuals, philosophers, and artists in the first half of the 20th century, including Virginia Woolf, John Maynard Keynes, E.M. Forster, Vanessa Bell, and Lytton Strachey. So a very interesting group of individuals there. Now I wanted to open this up to questions from the panel. Let's start with Art Ramon Garcia.
Yeah, I used to participate with a meetup group to learn sign language. So it was a social learning group, but I had a lot of problems with individuals who were kind of very low self-esteem guys who got really angry that all the girls were flirting with me rather with them. And then they would start to like character assassinate me and just spread rumors and just created a whole bunch of drama, you know, and that was just one of the turnoffs of being in these social learning groups. Was just certain people, like I said, these low self-esteem guys who thought like I was taking their women or something. And, you know, I'm an older guy, these were younger guys, and they just caused a lot of problems for me in these social learning groups. So, you know, what are your thoughts on avoiding drama in these social learning groups?
Thanks for that question, Art. That's a good question. In one sense, it's actually an advantage to be able to interact with people who are different from yourself so that you can learn, and even sometimes difficult people, because we all have to learn to deal with difficult people. It's one of the social skills. On the other hand, people can get out of hand, and it's you do need a leadership structure for your group, and there are limits, and things like that can definitely happen. And so you need to have some sort of basis upon which you can remove people from the group if necessary. That's probably a last resort. You'd want to talk to them and explain to them why you're having a problem with them, and they might decide to leave on their own. So basically, you try and start a group and hope for the best. If you are going to make it a sustained project with the board of directors, as I suggested, with having multiple groups under their direction, then you're going to come up with a more formal set of rules on how to manage your membership, and you'll have to deal with those kind of issues. But it's something we also need to develop skills to deal with, our communication skills and teamwork skills, and those are valuable in most professions anyway. So developing those general interpersonal skills is highly beneficial. And so even if we know you may encounter difficulties with difficult people in these groups, it's worthwhile, because that in itself is a challenge and something that we can learn from.
Yes, thank you, David. And of course, in my experience, interpersonal challenges seem to arise in any sufficiently large group of people. I have been chairman of the US Transhumanist Party for more than 7 years now. I can attest that the occasional interpersonal challenges that we have faced have been the most difficult aspect of my tenure as chairman. And that's irrespective of whether the meetings are online or in person. Some people will find ways to misbehave, and that does need to be addressed. There need to be clear processes for addressing that. And one cannot just hope that everybody will be reasonable and that everybody will be benevolent, unfortunately. But I think that's just a challenge of human group dynamics. It's not limited to an in-person format. There may be different ways in which people can misbehave, like online trolling may be more difficult to do in person, because with some of those troll-like behaviors, if people acted that way in person, it would not go well for them. But online, they have a few more screens, literally, to protect them. But anyway, I think this is a valuable conversation to have, because we always need to be prepared for these kinds of interpersonal challenges. Now, Jason, I wonder if you have some questions for David.
Yeah. I'm wondering, how do you go about deciding what should be in the curriculum? Because I remember when I started the Wisdom of the Crowd, I was wondering, what should be in the curriculum. And I got to thinking, well, who am I to say what should be in the curriculum? You know what I mean? Why should I expect everyone else to just like learn all the stuff that I think they should learn? You know what I mean? So that was another reason why I started with the opinion polls. So that way, part of that opinion process would be to decide on whether or not this lesson should be, in the group. Should it be in the required learning, unit or whatever, and stuff like that. So I'm curious as to how you set up what should be in the curriculum.
Thank you, Jason. It's a good question. With social learning groups, we don't really have to deal with the question of what will be in the curriculum, because the curriculum will be based on a book. In the case of personal development groups, it's a self-improvement book. In the case of self-study groups, it can be a textbook or any book. If you want to study the research papers of Albert Einstein, you can set that as the topic of your group, and you may find some people who have an interest in that, and then you can get together and do that. So it's your curriculum is guided by a book or an online course. As I said, you can group together multiple books or online courses into a program. But in the case of, for example, a personal development group where you wanted to have multiple books, multiple options, it would be up to each individual, their choice of which of those courses they wanted to study, unless they wanted to sort of commit to a complete program, which was a series of books. So that's how the question of curriculum is handled. It's already determined by someone who has created an online course or a book, and often by creating that and having an audience for that, they have shown that there's an interest in it and a demand for it. So you don't have to worry so much about, are you going to find people interested in it, because the market test has already been done. Whereas if you're making up your own curriculum, there's really no way to know how successful that will be, how that will appeal to your audience.
Yes, thank you for that response, David. And yes, for established curricula, there is more feedback already, and perhaps an easier way to gain a critical mass of participants, because they essentially know what they're getting into. But on the other hand, there are emerging subject areas or perhaps topics of particular interest where a structured curriculum has not yet been created. For instance, I've been considering creating a curriculum on transhumanist leadership to teach more people some of the lessons that I have learned in the course of my tenure as chairman of the Transhumanist Party, and perhaps help this approach to leadership to scale a bit so that we can grow the USTP and maintain the same kind of high quality interactions that we have had. As Jason just pointed out, a political party is probably one of the hardest kinds of groups to try to hold together. And yes, because people have very strong opinions about politics and they consider the political questions to be extremely urgent and extremely important to get just so according to their own preferences. And we endeavor to be a big tent here in the USTP, so we need to be able to accommodate these political differences without really laying down a dogma or a very strict party line. At the same time, of course, as transhumanists, we do stand for something. We do have some specific ideas that make us transhumanists as opposed to Democrats or Republicans or just ordinary humanists even. And those distinctions do need to be emphasized. Carlos Nato believes that this is a great idea to have a transhumanist leadership course. And Mike Lazine points out, this is why the Democrats and Republicans go through so many party chair people like it is going out of style. Yes, this is true. I have actually done some research on the history of national party chairpersons in the United States. I am only aware of 3 people within the Republican Party who had longer tenures than I did as chair of US Transhumanist Party, and none of those served after the year 1940. So that is quite interesting as well to look back at that history and consider, well, why did the chairman positions change so frequently? It was because there were all of these factions within the parties vying for power, essentially prioritizing their own, let's say, particularist agendas over the consistency of direction of the party. And instead of having the big tent approach, many of them had this very short-term approach. It was about winning the next election. It was about getting their own specific ideas in place. So essentially, the Republican Party, I will correct what I said, only had one chairman, Mark Hanna, who served longer than 7 years from 1896 to 1904. It was the Democratic Party who had 3 chairmen who served for longer than 7 years. William Barnum between 1877 and 1889, James Jones between 1896 and 1904, and James Farley between 1932 and 1940. So the last chairman with that longevity stepped down in 1940. And I do think a greater degree of consistency in leadership can help a party implement its vision. And hopefully we can manage that with the USTP and continue as a big tent. So now let's go to Ben Ballweg for his question to David.
David, I was planning to ask when you first recognized that social components were really useful for learning things. I was trying to think from my own history when I recognized that myself, and I was kind of surprised that it was like, well, maybe it was like I really started learning or working and studying on longevity really hard, like in winter of 2020, just as COVID was starting in. And then I was like, I got to start discussing this stuff with people. And kind of since then, like I almost hesitate to read a book unless I can find someone else that will be willing to discuss it with me, to kind of almost like kill 2 birds with 1 stone before I even read anything, to be like, all right, and I'll have a social component with this too. So I wanted to hear your personal story of when you recognized that a social component was so useful for learning something.
Thanks, Ben. So I went to college a couple of times. I did not do very well the first time, and started doing even worse the second time, so I dropped out. This was in the early 90s when we were having a recession, and I could not find work. I had no work experience. It was not good. So as my only option, I went back to college. But this time, I took a new approach. I decided, instead of being concerned with learning, which was what always put me off and discouraged me, was that I didn't feel I was learning things that were relevant, and so I'd become unmotivated. I decided to focus on being successful at school, just to show a future employer that I can be successful. And so I did go from terrible performance to getting straight A's in my last 2 semesters. And there's a range of skills that allowed me to do that. But one of them was definitely establishing a social group of other students who were equally interested in being successful. So instead of going home after school and trying to do my own studies, which I would not be motivated to do, I stayed, and I would do homework together with a group of students. And the goal was to get high marks, of course. So it wasn't about copying from anyone. We all worked together to learn how to do those problems. And we shared strategies on how to succeed. We learned about past test examples we could study and things like that. We learned that we could appeal our marks to the professors, a strategy which I used once to get a C changed to an A in a particular course because the professor had just not correctly recorded a couple of my assignments. So once you focus on actually being successful, it's possible to do it. And definitely one of the strategies was to connect with a group of people who are interested in learning. And I've used that ever since. Wherever I have been studying something, is to try and connect with other like-minded people, the top students in the class, essentially, who are equally interested in being successful and getting the maximum results from the program. And as I explained with the program they had at Berkeley, they developed there to help students with calculus. It was very similar to that. It was just self-organized. And so that's where I first started to realize the power of social learning groups. Since far earlier, growing up in the suburbs of Toronto, I realized the great lack of social engagement in the community. So my goals to establish greater social engagement through active community and social learning groups started further back than that. But specifically social learning groups, they're an essential component of being successful at any course of study, if your goal is to be more than just a student who gets a pass, if you really want to demonstrate optimal success.
Yes, thank you for that response. And I agree, there's a difference between learning to pass a course and learning to actually retain the material. And I think all too often students in conventional educational institutions just learn in order to pass the test and then move on, and they do not retain the knowledge very well. Hopefully with social learning groups, there would be more reinforcement of the knowledge, more ways of applying it that would help it become solidified in students' minds. Alan Crowley writes that he looks forward to the Sunday when a bar in the USA has the USTP Enlightenment Salon on all of their TVs and people hanging out, socializing about the topic of the week. That would indeed be a wonderful world. Hopefully, we can actually get there with persistent efforts, but we need to scale up this model of conversation. And I think the social learning group idea is one that could help us to do that. Matt Richards also writes, what distinguishes the USTP from other parties is that we are fighting for our survival in some way. Fighting for LEV, longevity, escape velocity, is fighting for life, for your loved ones' lives. And hopefully we can convey that motivational aspect to the broader public. Now let us go to Daniel Tweed for his question.
Yeah, this is a great topic. As usual, most of the Enlightenment Salons are. There's so many questions I could ask, but the one that really concerns me, I think, is I see feudalism as actually re-emerging in many unrecognized forms. A lot of people might think that you talk about China and they say, oh, well, China is a communist dictatorship. Well, the good news is they're actually not, but the bad news is they're actually a techno-feudalist kind of autocracy. So I guess I'm wondering if you could comment on the power of social learning groups to maybe combat this tendency toward feudalism re-emerging in so many forms in society. Maybe that's too broad a question, but any thoughts?
Thank you, Daniel. That's a great question. One of the benefits of social engagement is that it empowers individuals. And we've been experiencing over many decades now greater and greater isolation of individuals. We have fewer close friends. One of the things that happens is you're more vulnerable to stress and depression, and then you're more willing to your cognitive brain actually sort of shuts down in that condition, and you're more likely to just let the government take control and do what it wants. And there's some in government who would like that. Certainly in China, I think that's the case. So keeping the population stressed and depressed and isolated is advantageous to them. So we can work against that by starting active community groups, starting social learning groups, by engaging socially in many ways. It is literally a way of fighting against autocracy and feudalism, as you have termed it. So we have this problem not only in places like China, where I suspect they would never allow an active community group or a social learning group to function. I mean, they may allow social learning groups as long as the topic is specific enough. But in general, when governments are autocratic, they want to discourage any kind of social engagement, because they're worried that you're going to be planning things against the government, but also just that social engagement is empowering. It makes you less stressed, less depressed. Just being in the presence of other people reduces your cortisol levels. You feel safer, and you feel more able to think about problems. And when you have people to cooperate with and discuss those problems with, that's very empowering as well. So we're going through a massive transition in our society right now, where there's a flood of new technology, but we cannot solve all problems with technology. My focus has been on the things that have been left on the table as people have focused on technology so much. Technology is great, and there's a lot of benefits to it, but we need to pick up these things that have been left behind, and social engagement is one of the things that have been seriously neglected, and the result of that can certainly be opportunities open up for more autocratic government. And
Yeah,
that's
I
something we
don't
should
think we've
work against.
you actually need a social, interactive environment to allow natural leadership to emerge. There's a story that an Air Force Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty tells about being in the Army. He says, "This is the one useful thing I learned in the Army. They dropped off a Bailey Bridge, and they said, 'You guys, lunch is on the other side of the river. You guys got to build this bridge to get your lunch.'" And he said what happened was just this kind of, there wasn't any vote about who's going to do what. It's just there were natural leaders that read the instruction. They started like saying, "Okay, you guys ought to go over there and do that thing, and you guys should start doing that thing." And there, in a situation like that, there are natural kinds of leadership tendencies that emerge. So you have to have that social kind of group to allow that natural leadership ability to emerge. So I don't know. Would you agree with that dynamic much?
Yes, for sure. There's natural leadership, and in active community, we're going to train people specifically for leadership positions, junior leadership and senior leadership positions. And I think community-based organizations, or even something like a social learning group, can be a sort of gateway into developing leadership skills and developing an interest in your community, developing an interest in others, and then that can take you to developing an interest in local government or government in general. So it's definitely a way to develop leadership. Going back to Benjamin Franklin, his junto group definitely helped to develop his own leadership, and he became one of the leaders of the American Revolution and the early American government. And so, yeah, those social groups definitely have that advantage.
Maybe that's a special case because everyone's sort of in a crisis mode. Like, we got to get this thing done together. Let's let those who can do. Yeah, that's fine. If you can do it, I'll step aside and let you do it.
Yeah, and that's the type of thing you can do in a social learning group. You can make it. You can add practical elements to it like that. I've mentioned that it's based on books and online courses, but you could theoretically have a program that's more practical. My ideas for reforming public education actually involve transforming it to be much more practical. And in school, if for children, if I had my way, it would be, or if I could encourage people to do it in the way that I think it would be best, it would definitely be better to have things like that, where instead of just teaching kids math and reading and things like that, that you give them a bridge in pieces and say, here you go, and then watch the cooperation develop, which is what they also did in that program at Berkeley for the students. They didn't tell them the answers. Whenever they would ask, how do I do this problem, they would sort of give them hints or encourage them, but it was their own leadership, their own problem solving. They would ask questions, they would help each other, and that's a great social dynamic. It's very rewarding, in addition to the benefits of learning teamwork and leadership and the social benefits.
Thanks.
Yes. Thank you, David. Yes, those were great answers. And on the subject of authoritarian regimes trying to essentially discourage social connection and mandate a degree of atomization, Celeste Castaldo writes, yes, thank you. Social freedom is a truly democratic system. Oppressive regimes absolutely repress people from connection. And there are examples, for instance, in Putin's Russia, where completely apolitical civic groups have been suppressed, or even groups that were staging spontaneous demonstrations in support of the Russian government, but they weren't organized from the top down, and maybe they didn't get as many permissions as were required to host an official demonstration. But to that kind of regime, it doesn't even matter so much if you support them. If you show initiative that is outside of the approved parameters of the system, you can get shut down because they're afraid of the implications of an empowered citizenry. Now, also, I think back to the lockdowns in March 2020 going through May of that year, and the deleterious impacts that those lockdowns had on individuals' outlooks on life, and the ways in which some individuals' views of the world were distorted as a result of prolonged isolation. And I think back to both the riots that occurred in June of 2020, as well as the January 6th storming of the Capitol. I think both of those events arose out of the social isolation of the lockdowns, and they wouldn't have happened were it not for prolonged periods where individuals were prevented from making social connections. So then these tensions, these frustrations, essentially boiled over into some very destructive behaviors. So hopefully those are some lessons that can be learned to prevent these kinds of events from happening. And Carlos Neto points out that this is not just limited to, say, the Putin regime in Ukraine. All opposition has been banned as well. And indeed, the Ukrainian government has banned opposition political parties. And this is the problem. That part of the world is dominated by authoritarian regimes that wouldn't allow this kind of self-organizing activity that is the mark of free societies. So Alan Crowley has a question. How does having a use or purpose objective for the learning help to build cohesive bonds in the social learning group?
It's a good question. Thank you, Alan. People seek out meaning, connection, and purpose in their lives. This is one of the most fundamental things we've learned about fundamental human needs. Even they looked at what caused people who grew up in developed countries but who joined terrorist groups in the Middle East. They looked at them and they looked at why they joined these groups, and they were looking for connection, to be part of a group of people who shared their ideas and views. They were looking for meaning, something more meaningful than just their ordinary day-to-day lives. And they were looking for a sense of purpose, something with an objective that they were involved in doing things. And it's probably a commentary on our society that people needed to join terrorist organizations to get that, because we should have institutions in our society that offer us meaning, connection, and purpose. Traditionally, that's been offered by our family on the one hand and work on the other. And for people who go to a church, it's offered by the church. My intention with active community is that it offers another opportunity for meaning, connection, and purpose, because people are always going to be pursuing that subconsciously, and they'll be more satisfied once they have that. And that can solve a lot of problems. I think it can solve things like terrorism and school shootings, things like that, because a lot of those people who do that kind of thing are dealing with extreme social isolation. And if you look at any community, if I look at where I grew up, I grew up in a community where there was social isolation. There was no community engagement at all. It was in the suburbs, and in a period of time after which social engagement had been in steep decline for some time. I think television was an influence on the declining social engagement, but I think government interests might have played a role as well, as we discussed, government wanting more authority and wanting to pacify people, so discouraging social engagement. They certainly did nothing in the design of the communities to encourage social engagement. My neighborhood had houses to live in and shopping malls to shop at and movie theaters to go to, but there was no social engagement, no social institutions, no clubs for the youth or centers and activities where they could go to after school. So we do need to create opportunities for young people and adults so that they can develop their sense of meaning, connection, and purpose. And so yes, definitely you want some kind of goal, and then within active community or social learning groups, you have at least some goal to work towards, and then you have a group of people to work on it together towards that goal, whether it's a health, prosperity, or education goal. You can work together on it.
Yes, indeed. And Ben Ballweg mentioned in our internal chat that similar to the terrorist groups, this sense of connection could be responsible for the maintenance of gangs in US urban areas where young men who are otherwise socially isolated could be drawn to the gangs because the gangs provide community protection, sense of meaning and purpose. And I would hope that there could be more constructive ways to appeal to people in those situations. Celeste Castaldo writes in response to my remarks that I made great points. Even the US government attempts to go beyond its democratic limits in the world, as many non-democratic governments regularly do. And in response to the hopes that Alan had articulated for the widespread adoption of the discussion of these ideas, we would need to break through this duopoly that we have in the United States, because it does seem to me that the American duopoly wants to discourage meaningful social connection and engagement in intellectual spheres in the same way that authoritarian regimes try to do. It's just the duopoly has not been as successful in doing that yet. But if you consider the ideal relationship between individual citizens and the rest of society that the duopoly wants us to have, essentially, the duopoly does not want us to get to know other people in our neighborhoods or in our social circles, because the duopoly just wants us to receive messages from mainstream media about the causes of the day that we should care about from the Republican standpoint or from the Democratic standpoint. And the duopoly wants us to hate everybody who have different views on those issues. So the duopoly wants us to think that if somebody has a different point of view on abortion or on gun control than the specific media of the political parties are communicating during that given time, then that person is the enemy. That person should be hated. That person should be ostracized. So a lot of people have alienated their friends, their family members because of these disagreements, which really are abstract disagreements. They don't have immediate relevance to these people's lives. And furthermore, even if these disagreements are substantive, there could have been better ways to explore them. And there are many nuances of different people's positions on these issues that could have been explored in a more constructive setting. So I do think there are powerful forces working against this model where people can essentially connect and build up their intellectual skill sets and their intellectual activities. And I wonder, David, if you could comment on perhaps how one might effectively overcome this kind of adversity, both for people in bad circumstances, like the people who might be attracted to gangs or terrorist organizations, as well as the rest of us who are bombarded by bad media influences that want us to be isolated, that want us to be divided. How can social learning groups overcome that?
Thank you, Janetti. I think that touches on a core problem that we have in our society, and it's become worse and worse as our social isolation has increased. And that is that back maybe 100 years ago, before the Great Depression, we didn't used to rely on government for many things. I think the total tax burden was something like 10%. It was very low. This was before income taxes. People supported community schools. They paid their own fees to send their kids to school. And there wasn't much they needed from government. There wasn't the interstate highway system. There wasn't a large military. And since the Great Depression and the implementation of social welfare programs and interstate highways and all those wonderful things, we've been increasingly convinced to leave everything up to government. The problem is when you leave everything up to government, then everything gets run in the interests of government and in the interest of industry and finance, which has an influence over government. And then the media is part of that industry, and they reinforce the things that are beneficial to the government and the industry. So the solution to that is to take direct action ourselves and build these organizations like Active Community and social learning groups and anything else that's going to encourage social engagement and empower people to become more informed and involved in their own government and their own problems, solving their own problems. Because a project like Active Community is not primarily focused on empowering people to go and run for government. It's primarily focused on saying, look, there's a lot of things we can do to improve our lives that have nothing to do with government. So let's do those things. Let's focus on those things directly and just go ahead and do them. We don't have to wait for government to solve our problems. And we've been waiting for a long time, and we've neglected all these things that we could be doing ourselves that would be of great benefit to us. I mentioned all the different things that we can do to reduce our health risks, the type 2 diabetes, heart disease, dementia. We can do things to dramatically reduce our risks of those things. Type 2 diabetes, for example, about half of people can be off drugs, essentially diabetes free, if they follow a proper diet and exercise program. So people just don't know that, because that's not what is of interest to our government and our industry and the media. The media advertising comes from fast food corporations and processed food companies. They're never going to tell you that those things are bad for you. They're going to tell you that chocolate is actually good for you, alcohol is actually good for you, coffee. We can debate whether it's good or bad, but there are some negative things, and the negative things never get talked about, or at least completely disproportionately to the positive things that they say in order to promote these products. And these big companies have public relations agencies working for them to push what is beneficial to them into the media, and they have lobbies of the government. So we end up with a life that is in the interests of the government and industry. It's not in our own interests. So we have to start deciding what we want. Do we want that, or do we want something that's in our interest? And what is our interest? And I think health, prosperity, education, empowering ourselves, becoming more social, reducing our depression and anxiety, those are all very beneficial things for us. So the answer is to stop waiting for government to solve our problems. We will never get that message from the government. So we have to spread that message from the ground up.
Yes, indeed. And in our internal chat, Daniel Tweed writes that governments have massively failed to prioritize critical infrastructure redundancy. So your answer, David, is that we should build that ourselves, including our social infrastructure, because that involves the connections that people have with one another. And I would say those connections need to be both proximate and distributed. So there's value in knowing people from all over the world with similar interests and goals. This is what we try to do within the USTP. There's also value in knowing people in one's own community, in one's own geographical area, who also have similar challenges that they're facing, similar issues that should concern everybody, like the quality of the roads or the quality of the educational system or supply chain issues, for instance, that might affect the availability of goods and services, or housing prices in the community. And how do we make sure that housing is affordable? How do we make sure that there aren't huge populations of homeless people who are both suffering and making life difficult for others? So all of these issues, unfortunately, have been woefully unaddressed by governments. And Celeste points out that at least we in democratic nations have the power to choose our laws. And yes, democratic processes, if they work well, would empower the people to do that. Unfortunately, we have way too many oligarchic processes in the American political system, largely driven by the duopoly and its manipulation of laws and the institution of laws that make ballot access very difficult for minor political parties and make it difficult for the will of the people to really be known. Reforms such as ranked choice voting or proportional representation, or as has been discussed in the YouTube chat, abolishing the Electoral College, could help with allowing for greater representation, a multi-party system, as Alan Crowley puts it. All of those would help, but we don't even have to wait for those reforms. I think an excellent point that you have made throughout this salon, David, is that we can take action ourselves to create these infrastructure redundancies, to create this greater cohesion. So thank you very much for that. And Celeste also says type 2 diabetes can be reversed in early stages. So hopefully there will be social learning groups that address that, and healthy habits more generally. So now we have about 7 minutes left in our salon, and I would invite our panelists to make any closing remarks about the subject of the salon, any other thoughts that occur to them. Let's go to Ben Ballweg.
I will try this one. I'll just read it. You've been on a few salons at this point. I know these aren't designed as social learning groups, but they kind of are. I think Alan Crowley kind of had this question already. They focus on developmental topics every week. There's often a presentation, there's a little bit of banter, and we highlight what we learned at the end. Any chance you see that parallel? Might we be able to tailor our salons to be slightly more effective using the principles of social learning groups?
I think, thanks, Ben. I think it's possible if you want to hold a meeting that's specifically oriented towards that goal. There are definitely social benefits to social engagement virtually, but there are probably greater social benefits to interaction in small groups where you're working on together to solve a problem, and where you can talk about more personal issues that are going on with your life. So that may be something you don't want recorded and broadcast. So a virtual Enlightenment Salon would not be the place for that. But you can definitely have virtual groups where you have some goal to sort of brainstorm, or it can be based on a book, and to have a specific purpose and goal in the group. And you can break down into smaller groups to do that. And then that would that would make it more like a social learning group.
Yes, thank you for that, David. And now let's go to Art Ramon.
Yeah, I don't think we've talked about like after school religious Bible study type groups. I mean, they are learning their religious, what do we call it? The religious, whatever. Sorry. They're learning about the religion. And so a lot of groups, there are other groups who sort of oppose this because of, separation of church and state. So they kind of try to do their own thing, say like the Satanic Temple, they kind of do their own atheist program to kind of counter these religious studies that some of the Bible, court things do. So, what are your thoughts on that, on after school Bible studies?
Well, if it's an after school thing, it depends on whether it's directly sanctioned by the school. If it is, then it's probably a problem for separation of church and state. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, especially if they pay some fee to rent the room for that time, then it's can be completely separate. In general, Bible studies that are done as part of a church or any sort of additional social engagement can be very beneficial and are an example of a social learning group. It's based on a book, the Bible. Often these groups will use another devotional book to enhance their learning. And it's been demonstrated that participation in a church is beneficial to your health. We've talked about, I think on a previous broadcast, the blue zones, and one of the blue zones in the world, these zones where people live the longest, is the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, California. So there are aspects of being part of a religious group that can be socially beneficial, including the benefits to health that come with that.
Very interesting. Thank you, David. And I've often considered, how do atheists, secularists, rationalists replicate the benefits of these kinds of communities, obviously without the theology, because I do think a lot of people who attend church may be softly religious, but they do it for the social connection. But that social connection doesn't have to be linked to a belief in a particular doctrine or a particular type of doctrine, such as a theistic doctrine. So I actually think the Enlightenment salons have served that kind of purpose within the transhumanist community. Obviously, we don't have a physical building, but we do have a regular time when we meet. We have regular attendees. We have people who get to know one another over the course of these kinds of engagements. And we also focus on high-minded topics of discussion. Now, we have about a minute left, and there's an amusing question from Jason. What about homework? If the group is entirely virtual, then it's all homework, though of course we can devote a specific time segment to a discussion and to learning during the course of the discussion. But what about the in-person social learning groups? Do you conceive of them as having homework, David?
I'm not a big fan of homework myself. I do see its value, but it's, as I gave in my example of my own experience when I started to do well in college, it's better to do it as part of a group. You're gonna get all the social benefits of that you're gonna learn better, be more motivated, and then the health and wellness benefits as well.
Yes, and I'm inclined to agree with you. I have done so much homework as part of my high school and college studies. And high school was actually worse than college. I had about 5 hours a day of homework on average, in addition to my extracurricular activities. So I do think a better option is just to set aside structured time, and that could be interactive or solitary, to learn some particular skill or do a particular task. That works better than assigned homework. In any event, David, thank you very much for joining us today for a fascinating virtual Enlightenment Salon on social learning groups. Hopefully, more social learning groups will get started as a result of this conversation, and indeed that this will help people to fulfill some of their New Year's resolutions. And of course, one important resolution that we should all have is that we should live long and prosper.